Hello, and welcome to DC Vote's at-home version of our Statehood Matters podcast. As DC residents are staying safe at home, we've done the same thing with this podcast, and we'll be bringing it to you remotely as we can. I'm Bo Schuff. I'm the Executive Director of DC Vote, and for today's conversation, I'm joined by a member of the George W. Bush White House, a former fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, who is now a senior editor at The Atlantic, and an author. His latest book, Trumpocalypse, has just been released. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sorry we're remote.
I practiced saying Trumpocalypse probably seven times before doing this. It is quite the tongue twister. In the book,
the police can use it instead of a breathalyzer.
Well, there you go. Yeah, no, that'll. In this latest book, though, you talk about DC statehood as one of a handful of measures to revive American democracy. This isn't a position of yours that I understand has evolved a little bit over time. And why? So the question is, why do you think the statehood for DC is right? And why do you think it's right now?
Well, I've lived in the district since 1996. And like all of us, I've been exposed to kind of some of the lopsidedness and dysfunctions of the way this area is governed. And in my time here, it's grown from being a city of 550,000 people to now almost 750,000, bigger than Wyoming or Vermont or North Dakota or Alaska, or soon bigger than North Dakota and Alaska. Right. And so it was always something in my mind as a citizen and as a resident that the weird status of the district was actually interfering with my life and that of my children in important ways. But it wasn't a high priority issue for me. It was just something I thought, it's strange that this important city doesn't have the full spectrum of government that you would expect. And as DC emerged from the control board experience and found its footing, it struck me as odder and odder. But I've become more interested in the issue since 2010 as part of a general worry about American politics and especially the Senate and how radically unrepresentative the Senate is. And much of that can't be fixed. It's in the US Constitution. But are there things we could do that would make a difference? And DC statehood seems like one of the obvious answers. It would create an area that it would add 2 Democratic seats, probably. It would add, very likely, a couple of senators of color. It would make the Senate less weirdly unrepresentative, and could do some good things for the district too.
I mean, it really has to get into the rural-urban divide that we see a lot in the country, and the underrepresentation of urban areas.
Yes. One of the things I am asked a lot about the book is, well, why are you so sure about statehood for DC, and I'm not similarly full-throated about Puerto Rico?
Sure.
And my answer to that is, if everything I know about, which isn't much, about Puerto Rican politics tells me that that island is fairly evenly divided between people who want statehood and people who don't, and there's a considerable minority who still prefer Puerto Rican outright independence. And so I think you don't even enter into the question about statehood until you know that the place is unanimous about wanting to remain part of the United States in the first place. You don't want to create a Catalonia or Quebec-like problem.
I think we're going to get some clarity. It sounds like they have added it to a ballot initiative in November.
Well, I wouldn't count on that because
in
the past when they voted, they've always had a 3-way vote. There have been 3 options:
right, okay.
Statehood, independence, or the status quo. And the status quo was 1. They're now offering people only 2 choices: statehood or the status quo. And you may discover at that point that there's a big majority for the status quo, and actually the statehood issue may disappear because the independence-minded people will, I assume, vote for the status quo over statehood.
Sure. What are some of the other democracy reforms you talk about in the book? I haven't had a chance to pick it up yet. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, I talk about getting rid of the filibuster, which is part of dealing with this problem that we're on the way to a situation where 30% of the country will have not only an outright majority in the Senate, but almost enough of the Senate to pass a constitutional amendment. And so given that the Senate is becoming more and more lopsided as Americans move to cities, The idea that you would then say, and on top of that existing constitutional lopsidedness, we're going to add 10 extra votes. That just strikes me as terribly unfair. I think we also need a replacement Voting Rights Act. Not enough people remember this, but my former boss, George W. Bush, signed the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act in 2005. The Voting Rights Act was then substantially weakened by the Supreme Court in 2013. The Supreme Court, that case, although it's very notorious, what the Supreme Court said was not crazy in that case. What they said was the sections of the Voting Rights Act were striking down. Say a state or a jurisdiction gets extra scrutiny according to its bad behavior 50 years in the past, 100 years in the past, and 150 years in the past. And that's just not rational. And the Supreme Court was not wrong about that, because the sections it struck down said there's extra scrutiny for Hawaii, where there are no voting problems. And meanwhile, one of the places that was exempt from special scrutiny was Wisconsin, which is the worst actor north of the Mason-Dixon line. So the Supreme Court's right that history is not a good gauge to whose voting practices should be scrutinized now. And the Supreme Court then invited Congress to pass a new Voting Rights Act fixing these problems, which Congress never did. So let's do it.
Got it. You've got some pretty significant departures from many Republicans on DC statehood. I think probably on some of the VRA comments. What do you say to Republicans when you're talking about statehood, and how is it consistent with their values?
What I would say is, through most of my early adult life, from 1968, from let's say 1970 to 1990, the Republican Party dominated national politics. It won not only more presidential elections than the Democrats, but it won them by huge margins in 1972 and 1984, nearly 60% of the vote for Presidents Nixon and Reagan. And in 1988, 54% of the vote for George H.W. Bush. This used to be a party that was able to connect with a great American majority. And in the 21st century, it's lost its ability to do that. Now, normally, what a party that's losing touch with people does is it rethinks some of its positions, the way the Democrats did in the 1990s with Bill Clinton. They said, we're losing a lot of elections. We need to readjust. We need to rethink. And that's how democratic change works, is, one side wins, the other side, gets better.
Right.
What the Republicans have been doing since 2010, since the early 21st century, saying, we're not going to change. What we're going to do is we're going to change the electorate. We're going to shrink the electorate to the point where we have few enough voters that our ideas can win. That's not good for anybody, and it's not good for you, because it's going to push you into ever more extreme and impossible directions where you're just giving up on being competitive. So what we need to do is we need to take off the table the option, we're going to win by shrinking the electorate. Let's just take that off the table. The electorate is the electorate. Now, compete.
Yeah. Let me put a finer point on it, or maybe be a little bit direct. And I mean this question with the utmost of respect. The president recently said in the New York Post that we were not going to have DC statehood unless, quote, we have some very, very stupid Republicans. So I just have to ask, Mr. Frum, are you a very, very stupid Republican? Which I know the answer to, but
I'm not a big admirer of the president's. But one of the things even his best friends would say is Donald Trump is not a man with a long time horizon. So he doesn't think about a question like, how are we going to have a competitive two-party system in the year 2040? But I think about it. Look, I'm a conservative person. In general, I want to see rules and regulations that make it possible, make it easy to start a business, make it encourage businesses to flourish. I think people should keep more of their own money in their pockets. That's where the center right is. So how do you build a competitive center right party? And the answer is the party has to grow up with the country. I mean, imagine you're back in 1925 and you're a Republican at a time when the Republicans are the party of Protestants. And you say, we should make no consent. We should never think about how do we attract Catholics into the Republican Party. Catholics will be Democrats forever. Republicans will be Protestants. That's not the future. The parties grow by always finding ways to absorb new people. So left and right, that's part of our politics. It's part of the human brain. So what I'm interested in is say, how do we make it so that in the year 2040 and in the year 2050, it makes sense that in the year 2050, you've got brother and sister who are African American, and the brother owns a business and the sister's the head of a school system, sister's probably going to lean toward the Democrats and the brother's probably going to lean toward the Republicans. You shouldn't then find some way to say to the brother, you own a business in every way, you should be one of us, but we're going to insult you until you don't. How is that competitive? You want to be competitive. You go find the people who have interest in common with yours, and then you say, how do I remove unnecessary barriers? And then you have to say, if we're going to stay a democracy, how do we have a strategy for competing that doesn't rely on saying we're going to disenfranchise large parts of the American population?
Sure. We often refer to DC's lack of statehood as the original form of voter suppression. So that argument, makes a lot of sense to me, that the goal is to get more people, all of the people, involved in the election. So we think it's one of the key important pieces of statehood.
Yeah, and what I would also say to President Trump is, none of us have any idea what the issues of the 2040s and 2050s are going to be,
Sure.
And how groups are going to realign themselves in the light of those issues. And you shouldn't be so pessimistic. You should believe that your ideas are attractive, and that if more people heard them, I mean, not everyone's going to support your ideas.
Sure.
In a free country, if your country's getting, there's a party in your country that's getting 95% of the vote, you probably don't have a very fair democratic system in your country. You don't want everybody, that would be bad. But how do you constantly expand your coalition? And how do you do it in ways that allow participation, not suppress competition?
Great. David, thank you so much. I appreciate hearing a conservative voice for statehood, and hearing that perspective. I look forward to reading the book. Where can I find it?
It's at Politics and Prose, who
Okay.
have been good for the book. It's
Which
available.
we can now do curbside delivery for, so that's good.
Yeah. Other DC bookstores as well, and of course any of the online vendors will have the book.
All right. Thank you very much for being with us. I appreciate your time.
Thank
Be
you
well.
so much.
Thanks.